What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Long Game Podcast hosted by Thomas Kopelman and Trayton DeVore. In each episode, you'll hear us break down financial topics that are relevant to the lives of millennials and other young professionals. Our goal is to help bring credible financial information to you in short, bite-sized episodes.
Thomas Kopelman and Trayton DeVore are the co-founders and financial planners at All Street Wealth. All opinions expressed by Thomas and Trayton are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of All Street Wealth. This podcast is for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered advice. Please consult with your financial advisor, tax, legal, and any other advisors you have before making any decisions regarding your financial plan.
All right. What's up and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Mike Zung. He is a financial planner. He owns Java Wealth. He's just honestly a great financial planner. You're one of the first people, you probably don't know this, that I went to when I was trying to learn about equity compensation. You have great content on it, great YouTube. And in the very beginning, I was like, man, this equity compensation stuff is so complex. I don't know anything about it. And reading about it is actually really tough. But YouTube videos around it is extremely helpful. So I guess before we even get into it, this is kind of cool for me because you were one of the first people that I think had an influence on my learning.
Awesome. Yeah. That's really cool to hear. So I guess first, just really, thanks for having me on and give me an opportunity to do this. But yeah, I mean, that's why I started doing YouTube stuff, because just people learn different ways, and I've always been a visual learner, and doing whiteboard and things like that is the way that helps me think about stuff. And so I just figured, it's like, hey, I hate writing, so may as well do some video that tries to explain a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. And the other good part about it too is search, right? Like Twitter or like blogs or whatever. It's really hard to actually get people to you from search, but YouTube has an awesome search engine, and there are people trying to learn about equity compensation on there, that it opens up a different door that a lot of other content like podcasts don't. Like nobody finds that podcast from searching about AMT, which is our topic today. But if we put it on YouTube, they might.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I just got back from XYPN Live. And I did a talk on exactly this, on creating YouTube content. And yeah, a big part of it is just the power of YouTube. And if you put evergreen content on there, that it's a search engine, and it's where people go to try to find answers to this stuff. And so these videos that I've done around equity compensation and AMT and all that stuff, I did a lot of these videos in 2020, 2021, and they're getting just as many views today as they did whenever I first put them out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I keep hearing all those stories, and I'm like, what? I'm going to get on YouTube. My barrier for so long has been on the video editing side. Like I have all the content. I love sitting down and talking, but I was just like, I don't want to do it. And my new hire loves YouTube and loves that kind of stuff, even though he's going to be my financial planner. So he's going to own all of the editing. So my goal is January 1, we're going to have a consistent schedule on YouTube, just because, why not? It's another good avenue.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, seeing the amount of content that you have plenty of stuff to talk about.
I got the scripts out there.
Yeah. And really, exactly. And even all of these things that you've been doing here, like that, you've been recording these podcasts and recording the video of it. That's a ton of content right there too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, before we get into today's topic, let's just kind of let you give an overview of who you are, what you do, your firm, that stuff. And then we'll start talking about ISOs and AMT.
Yeah, sure. So Mike Zung. I am actually a career changer. I used to be in tech. I was in software development for a long time, but then decided that I try not to call it a midlife crisis, but it was right around 40 that I decided, I don't think I want to do this for the rest of my life.
Okay, you look way younger than that.
Right? Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't know if that's just
that's a good thing.
Yeah, I guess it's a good thing. I don't know if it's what's word I'm looking for. Just like being immature or anything like that, but hopefully it's
definitely not because of that.
I launched my firm, and I focus, naturally I wanted to focus on tech professionals. And actually I'm based in Kansas City. And so in this area, there's actually not a ton of equity compensation. So I actually didn't come out thinking that I would do equity comp specifically, but more just like, hey, I can actually speak the language. So Java Wealth being my firm, that's a little nod to the programming language that I primarily used. But as I was getting into it, then I was getting a lot more equity comp, a lot more clients that had equity compensation, and seeing the complexities around it and just all of the different planning opportunities around it. It just makes a whole lot of sense as far as being able to talk intelligently about it and all the different planning around it. And then also whenever it comes to liquidity events and IPOs and things like that, it's a natural trigger point or a pain point that says, hey, I need to reach out to a financial planner that knows about this stuff, because I could make mistakes that have lots of zeros on it.
For sure. And this is a great talking point to go into what we're going to discuss today, but also why, like, hey, if this is you and you're going to have a liquidity event, you should have reached out 3 years ago.
Right.
And so for all these people, I have a ton of clients coming on who, now IPOs got pushed back a couple of years, and they came on thinking it was going to be this year. It's actually a win for them, right? And we're going to go into ISOs today where, like, there's not a whole lot of, you can still do some planning, but when you have a lot of ISOs that you didn't exercise and this is the year that you're going to IPO, you're going to have a lot of tax. Like, that's naturally how it's going to be. And you're going to have a lot of AMT, which we're also going to talk about today, where you could have probably planned over the last 4 years and either had none or a very small amount of AMT compared to what's going to happen in that year.
Yep. Yeah. So, a lot of times whenever people come to us, then it's just like, oh man, if only we would have talked a year ago. But
yeah, we could have saved you 6 figures in taxes if we would have had a couple of years of planning. But let's just set the stage here. So I've talked about equity compensation some. We haven't specifically gone into too much detail just on ISOs. So maybe you kind of walk through, like, what are ISOs, who gets ISOs, and I think naturally you have to talk about just the tax implications of that.
Right. Yeah. So ISOs are incentive stock options. It's primarily people that usually it's not a company that's public yet whenever you get ISOs, but there are some that do, but it is more common whenever the company is still private, and they reward these incentive stock options to their employees. And the whole purpose of it, I guess, first, just backing up a little bit, for a stock option is that, like, you don't actually own the stock yet, but you have the option or the choice of buying that stock at a particular price. So that's the exercise price, strike price. There's a few different names that you hear for it. And then so with that, it's a thing where you can pay that exercise price to actually turn that into a share of company stock that you own, right? And so that's just the basics of a stock option, right?
Yeah. Pretty. I mean, I would say they're pretty basic, but the other thing to add is just that there's some vesting schedule, and it's definitely what you want to understand too, because I have clients come in all the time. They're just like, I have ISOs, and the vesting matters. Like, until they vest, which is maybe 1 year to start. What I see most often is you get 25% at the end of year one, and then it goes month to month till end of 4 years, where all of them have, are able to be exercised. But until they're able to be exercised, they're worthless. And even when you can exercise them, but you haven't, technically they still are worthless, because most times, as you said, with ISOs, private company, and sometimes you might have the ability to sell them, whether the company is buying them back, whether there's a secondary market you can use it on. But there's still a good amount of time, especially the earlier on the company is, that you would exercise those shares, but you wouldn't have anything to do with them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's a really good point. And there is some risk involved in doing that, obviously, because whenever the company's private, if you have to pay this money to exercise them, and you're somewhat gambling, or you're putting a bet. I shouldn't say gambling, but you're betting on the fact that company is going to have some sort of liquidity event to where the actual shares of stock are actually going to be worth something in the future.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's what the hard part around them are, right? So, like, maybe here, I'm gonna have you walk through the tax side of this, so then we can go back into the point I would make.
Yeah. Yeah. So just the basic taxes of ISOs, and for people that are just listening to this, go watch my YouTube channel, my YouTube video that talks about this, because a whiteboard video does a lot better than me just talking numbers. But the idea is that whenever you exercise your stock option, then whatever difference between the strike price, the price that you had to pay for it, and then what the actual value of that option is. That gap is it's called your bargain element. Basically, it is a type of income that gets realized, but in the regular tax code, no one cares about, or they don't care about it in the regular tax code.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the big difference between ISOs and NSOs. So like the people, just know they have stock options, but this is where you actually have to know the type, because NSOs, the bargain element is taxed at your income rate.
Yep.
ISOs, there's technically no tax there, just on that spread, unless you trigger AMT.
Yep. Yeah. And I guess the incentive part of incentive stock options, the idea of why they have a better tax treatment. Like you said, with if it's not an incentive stock option, if it's a non-qualified stock option or an NSO, that as soon as you exercise it, then whatever gap that is, whatever spread that is, you just realized income and you're paying taxes on it, right?
Yep.
But you said like it's just considered income, and so you're paying your regular income tax rate. But with ISOs, it's a thing where you can exercise it, and if you hold on to it. The two big dates are you need to hold on to it more than a year from the time that you exercised it, and then 2 years from the time that the option was granted to you, right? So once you hold it past those 2 dates, then at whenever you do sell, then all of the difference of the price that you sold it at and the strike price that you paid for it all gets treated as long-term capital gains,
which is super advantageous.
Yeah.
Which is where we're talking about. This is where you want to have a lot of time to do the planning, is because you might have that IPO event and you might not have the time. And we've all seen what happens to stocks typically after an IPO. Very rarely they're way higher than at that period of time.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So I think, so you talk a little bit now about AMT, right? And because that's like the hidden tax trap that we know about. It's not easy to calculate. Obviously we have softwares to help us do it and plan, but almost nobody we see is planning for AMT, and it's a pretty big hit.
Right. Yeah, it definitely can be. Just I try to back up, and again, watch the video. But AMT, the way that I think about it and the way that I try to explain it is that every year, whenever you're plugging in your taxes, there are 2 separate calculations that are happening. So there's the normal tax code where you just have, your income, you have your deductions, just going through all that stuff, and then you have a taxable income. And then, you do the math on it with the tax rates and all that stuff. And you just come out with a number of like, hey, based on the regular tax, the tax system, this is how much you owe. Right. And then, so just a little bit of history. It was like back in the 60s where there were just a handful of taxpayers that they saw. It's like, hey, they were making a good amount of money, but they didn't pay any taxes at all. And so the government was like, hey, we need to close some of these loopholes so that we can, so that these people don't work the system too much, right? And so that's how AMT was born. That this alternative system to say, let's come up with a different formula so that these people that are getting away with not paying any taxes have to pay some amount of taxes.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what we can blame as far as why AMT came to be. Right.
Yeah. And the hard part about AMT is it comes at 26 or 28%, right? Like I've talked to a few people who early on in a company, they're in the first few years, they have ISOs, they didn't have an 83B election that they could file or anything. And they're like, hey, I'm going to go exercise this. Like, let's say they have, 10,000 shares at $1 a share, right? So cost them $10,000. They're like, great, I have these. I'm going to start the long-term capital gains clock.
Right.
But what ended up happening is like the share of the company now is worth like $50.
Right.
So now it's $49 times by 10,000 is 490,000 of that bargain element.
Right.
And so they're looking and they're like, oh my gosh, my income's already really high. Like I could have only done, let's call it like 80,000 before I triggered AMT. So now I have $410,000 that is going to end up probably at the 28% tax rate.
Right.
Now you're sitting there and you're like, oh my gosh, what I thought was going to cost me 10,000, I have no tax, just put me into $100,000 AMT tax bill. Right. That I actually don't have the cash to do anything with right now.
Right.
And that's where this hard part and why people have to know about AMT.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, just to kind of finish painting that picture of there's the regular tax, and then yeah, whenever we drop into that AMT system, then yeah, there's a new definition of what income is. And so all this bargain element stuff that we're talking about with the stock options, that's ignored in that regular system. But yeah, what in your example, this $490,000 of bargain element from the stock options gets added into there. And so in that separate system, it says, hey, you actually made way more money than what we calculated over here in this first system. And so that's where it gets into this place where, there's a different formula that you hit, and you owe, tens of thousands of dollars more than what you expected, because this is a type of income that a lot of people don't really think about, like, because you're not actually bringing home any of that money. It's kind of, you're getting taxed on money that you plan on having in the future.
Yeah. And then the hard part about it, right, is like, we talk to people all the time. Most people don't understand taxes in general.
Right.
Like we see all the tax myths that people have.
Yep.
They barely understand marginal taxes. They barely understand like self-employment taxes.
Yep.
They definitely don't understand AMT, because I'm sure you've talked to other advisors. None of the other advisors, pretty much, unless they specialize in this, know anything about AMT on these ISOs, which is why I think you and I, this is part of the niche that we work with, is because we realize there's mistakes that can happen that are really costly. Right. The planning can be really valuable. Like even just planning around this exercise and how to use what is left in that before they trigger AMT can save people 5 to 6 figures in their tax bill.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And maybe just to show a little bit of grace, the tax system's hard. Saying like, yeah, most people don't know about the tax system. It's like, it's because it's become very complicated as the years go on. So yeah, AMT is kind of this perfect storm of, it's difficult, it's confusing, and it can cost you a whole bunch of money if you don't plan for it. Right. Yeah. So it's a perfect recipe for just being this scary thing.
100%. Is there anything else that just like you want to add on how they work or the taxes behind them?
Yeah, I guess the last thing to think about, I guess there's a couple things. So one of the things that you had started to mention is that, there is a, whenever you do both of them and with just normal income, there's usually, your main system is going to be the one that gets the higher number. And there's usually some amount of room that you have before you trigger AMT. And so this might get into some of the planning opportunities stuff, but you can exercise some amount of options and stay under the AMT limit. So you can somewhat do that tax-free still and not have to worry about AMT. So that's one of the things. And actually, I probably should back up a little bit. Whenever we talk about that bargain element and how it can trigger AMT, one of the big rules around that is that only comes into play if you exercise the option and you don't sell it within that same calendar year. Mm-hmm. Right. That's the only time where that becomes income for the AMT system. Right. But if you exercise and you sell within that same year, then you don't have to worry about it. Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And then let's see, what else? I think that's some of the main stuff around just kind of the basics of AMT. Oh, the other one I was going to talk about is the credit. Mm-hmm. So without going into all the nitty-gritty details, if you do something where, hey, you trigger AMT, you have to pay that amount, then at least some of it, if not all of it, gets carried forward as what's called the AMT credit, to where you can actually slowly get that money back. It can get really complicated as far as what levers
to pull to get that back.
To pull to try to get that AMT credit back. But that's definitely a big thing too, where if you've triggered AMT largely because of incentive stock options, then it's not a complete loss. It's just you're paying taxes sooner on that income than you otherwise want to, and you can get that back over the following years.
Yeah, I think that's something that gets missed a lot is people don't get told that part. And obviously it's because it's not a guarantee that it's all going to come back.
Yeah.
And it might most likely is a partial amount, but still it becomes this planning issue of like, how do we have the liquidity to handle this now, even though it will come back down the line?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it is it's a cash flow issue as much as anything of how am I going to pay this AMT bill? Because remember, we're holding on to the stock and we haven't actually sold it. So we're not bringing any money home. And so you're going to have to look elsewhere to cover this tax bill a lot of times.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think the best place to go next is starting to think through like the exercising around this and just some planning opportunities, because I think, from my experience, what people come in to me thinking about is, well, what even is the strategy on this, right? Like we don't want to get too concentrated here, but we obviously like part of working here is that we do believe in the company and we want some exposure and we have discounts to do that. And when I think about NSOs, to me, NSOs are a lot easier on the exercise strategy because it's kind of like, you might as well wait later and see is there liquidity events coming. You might have more tax on that difference between fair market value and your exercise price, but there's no reason to take the risk and pay tax at your income rate, which for a lot of these people is pretty high. If we have no idea any liquidity event is coming, right? Like let's just wait till that time, exercise, sell. But the ISOs is a lot harder, right? Because the earlier you exercise, the lower that the bargain element is, the more likely you are to have no AMT or just a small amount of AMT. But you're doing this potentially 2, 5, 10 years before a liquidity event could come. And so you are putting a lot more risk in that situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. As far as the planning goes, and to what you were talking about, I kind of think of them in a few different phases, right? So a phase of where the company is as far as its growth, right? So if you're an early employee and you have ISOs that are granted to you, then yeah, the strategy around that is, okay, are you willing to essentially just risk the exercise price, the cost to actually turn them into shares early on while your strike price is close to the actual value of it and the company hasn't, they haven't exploded or anything. So in that case, that spread between the two is very small, if anything at all. Right. And so that is just a conversation around, are you willing to potentially flush this money down the toilet to exercise the shares? But then once you do, then there's no AMT or anything like that. Yeah. And you've started your clock and all that stuff.
And then for that group, for me, unless you're in a horrible financial situation, maybe you have no assets, like, high interest debt, et cetera. A lot of times to me, it's like, that's kind of a no-brainer really early on. It's like, why are you taking a role at a company that early on? Because you're probably giving up some amount of income to get that type of equity compensation. Like, hopefully you believe in your company enough for 10,000 shares at $1, right? Like, but if you don't, maybe that changes the whole conversation, but not that it's like a complete no-brainer, but it's kind of close to one for me.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Whenever, if your strike price is, in the, under $1, and it's not going to materially affect your overall finances, then take a flyer on it as much as anything. Right. So that's the first part. And maybe we won't get too far into the whole, because you mentioned the 83B election that, I plan on doing a video on this actually.
Yeah. And I've done a podcast on the 83B election.
Oh, sweet. Yeah.
Because a lot of that goes with obviously ISOs, but a lot on the restricted stock for the founder side. So we did it in a founders series because I actually had a girl reach out to me who they had an idea. It basically got into an incubator. They recapitalized at 24 million, forgot to do the 83B election, and she owns 33% of that company. Yeah. And so next year tax bill, she's supposed to owe on the difference between 0 and 8 million of hers. She was like, what am I supposed to do with this 2 million plus I owe in taxes? And I was like, I'm sorry. Not much at this point. That's obviously a really tough situation.
That's definitely tough. Okay, so I won't go into that. So everyone that's listening, go back to your episode on 83B elections. The other phase that I think of is whenever you start approaching a liquidity event or an IPO, and so in that case, that's it's a much closer, not 100%, but it's much closer to hey, this is actually going to turn into some real stuff. And so that is where we really start thinking about AMT, because that's most likely when you are going to exercise and you're going to hold on past that calendar year. And so you will create this bargain element. And so so with that, it's exercising, kind of timing it right to where you exercise it and you're not going to sell it for another year. So a lot of IPOs, there's a 6-month lockup period. So if you think, hey, I'm going to exercise it around 6 months before the actual IPO, that once you get past the lockup period and you can sell, that they're qualifying now, and that you can have long-term capital gains on the entire amount.
Yeah.
Right. So that's probably a big part of it. But then, in order to hold it for an entire year, then you've put it past that calendar year. And then that's whenever you got to think about AMT and the liquidity of it, right? Because whenever you sell it, it depends, like, did you sell it before tax day? Right. So like, or do you need to come up with the cash flow to pay your tax bill first, and then be able to sell your shares and cover and recoup that amount.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think when you think of these companies, there's 3 phases, and that's what you're getting at, right? You have like these early on, then you have pre-IPO, and then you have post-IPO.
Right.
And in general, like as you go through these phases, like 1 and 2 is really where you're probably making these exercise options and trying to be wise with the whole AMT thing. I mean, I don't see it very often that people wait to post liquidity event to then start exercising options.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do see, and I mean, granted, just my own anecdotal experience, there are some where, yeah, you exercise some of them, but some of them, they're still vesting. You've gone public and they're still vesting. And so that to me is the other phase of it, where you're figuring out how much to, like, whether you want to exercise and hold. And I call it play the ISO tax game. I actually have a whole other live stream where me and another advisor that specializes in this, we talk for like an hour and a half or something on it. So if you really want to get into the details, but yeah, then it's talking, it's figuring out, you're always really, all of this stuff is informed by the tax consequences of what you're doing, right? It's like, it's the whole thing of not wanting taxes to drive everything, but you definitely have to keep it all in mind, right? So with ISOs, what I was saying, where maybe you just want to exercise enough to where you go up to, it's called the AMT crossover. Like you exercise enough to where you butt right up against AMT, but you don't go over it, right? So you do that. And then also, it's a thing where if you have other kind of equity, so where at least I geek out on it, is that you have ISOs, but maybe you have some non-qualified stock options too,
or
right?
RSUs. That's what I'm saying.
Or RSUs too. But especially with the non-qualified stock options, or I guess ISOs that you've exercised before and are willing to sell, then that moves a lot of these other numbers to say, hey, maybe I can purposefully realize some more income by exercising and selling some of these non-qualified stock options. And that gave me more room to exercise and hold more incentive stock options. Or the other part, and I won't go into all the details of how this affects AMT, but whenever you sell, like if you've exercised incentive stock options and then they're qualifying and then you sell them, then selling those incentive stock options also kind of accelerates how much AMT credit you can get back. Because there's 2 different cost bases that you have to keep track of and all that kind of stuff. But it's a thing where, if you're working with an experienced planner that knows how to do this stuff, then you can really dial in a lot of stuff of, hey, let's realize this much income. Let's sell some of these ISOs that are qualifying now, and now we can exercise and hold even more, right? So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's like, we're getting in the weeds here, which is helpful, because I think the thing that you almost have to get through to everybody in this is like, this is a lot going on. Like, we get it. Like you're not trained in this, your goal, you're not supposed to be the person who can navigate all of these. Like, I don't know about you. I mean, for me, I went through so many client cases of like learning and talking to advisors and learning from that, talking to advisors. Like, it takes a lot of time to really figure all of this out. And then right when you do, changes happen in tax laws, and now you have to refigure out like what that looks like, which we're going to get to at the end of the episode.
Yep.
Anything else that we want to start to talk about here on like planning things to think about? I think like obviously big one is planning around AMT and,
Right.
you know, maybe spreading that out over a few years. I think you just want to do a couple other points of like how to use other income sources or exercising, but you know,
Right.
what other planning objectives do you see around this?
I mean, yeah, that's probably the main stuff. Again, that it informs it. But then really the other part that I really enjoy about all of this is that you could have two different client situations that they have the same amount of equity, but really what all this stuff comes down to is what do you actually care about and how much do you need to actually take off the table, right? Because yeah, again, I could have two separate clients. One, we just say like, hey, we're just selling everything. We're just taking it all off the table. I'd have another client where they have other stuff going on to where we can go ahead and take a flyer on more of these ISOs and hold on to more of it. So yeah, that kind of don't lose focus on what actually matters to you just to try to save a few bucks on taxes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. Well, let's walk into, you know, we obviously are future proof together and you're like, hey, I'm excited to come on this and talk about it. I also want to talk about this, you bring it up, is like tax changes that are coming or set to come or set to sunset, I guess, in 2026, and how that will change everything that we're talking about, which to be honest was not something I was thinking about on my radar. So I'd love for you to update what these changes are, and we could talk about maybe how that does change planning a little bit ahead of that.
Yeah. So I guess going a little bit into the past, that it was the tax changes that happened in 2017. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Yep.
So
I always try to say Trump something, and then I'm like, no,
right.
that's not what it's called.
Right. Yeah. So that tax change really affected how many people were caught up in AMT. Where it dropped from, I was looking it up. It's just like, went from like 5% of all taxpayers down to 0.1%, right? Because of some of the primarily the changes around how there's a cap on state and local taxes on how much you can itemize there, and then also the rules inside of AMT about how much the exemption is, how much income you can subtract from it, and then what the phase out is. Like, it doesn't start phasing out until like, a married couple makes over $1.1 million or something like that. That's whenever it starts phasing out. So like all these changes made it to where a lot of people that used to get caught up in AMT a lot no longer had to worry about it. Especially, and it was primarily a lot of people that live in high income states. So a lot of California and New York residents, they used to get caught up in AMT that they didn't anymore, primarily because of those state local property taxes, all that stuff gets added back into AMT, but it's way lower now. So that's kind of the world that we're in right now, is this very few people getting caught up in AMT. It's primarily just people that are exercising options. And maybe a couple other scenarios where you're super high income or something like that, or have a lot of long-term capital gains. But yeah, so that's the world that we're living in now. And so if you're exercising stock options, then you have AMT, but in future years, you can recoup that AMT credit, because you're not getting caught up into the AMT system anymore, right? But yeah, as of right now, it's those changes are going to sunset after 2025, and so in 2026, if nothing happens, then it's going to spike back up to where there's going to be a lot of people that used to get caught up in AMT that are going to get caught up again, and if that happens, then that AMT credit, they might not be able to get that AMT credit anymore, right? Because like, hey, if you're an AMT, then like if you trigger AMT, then you don't get an AMT credit. Like that's just the way that it works.
Okay, that makes sense. So basically, just key summary is that like people used to have AMT a lot. 2017 till now, AMT is way harder to trigger. Yep. Pretty soon here, if that sunsets, we're going to go back to a world where like there's a lot of people being hit with AMT way sooner. And so how are you thinking about this with your clients, right? We're approaching in 2023. So we have about this year and 2 more years. Are you trying to like help push people to use these brackets now and not trigger AMT even ahead of it? Or, what are you thinking?
Yeah, possibly. And yeah, I mean, we obviously can't predict the future. There's talks of both parties actually wanting to extend these changes. So I don't mean to sound the alarms too bad, but yeah, as far as conversations and planning opportunities, is that if someone does have an AMT credit, that yeah, just thinking of, okay, maybe in these next few years we do a couple moves that could accelerate that to where you can actually get that credit back. The primary one that I'm thinking of is selling some of those shares so that it does that stuff where it accelerates the amount of credit that you can get back.
That makes sense. So, I mean, yeah. So not a whole lot that can be done, obviously a little bit here and think through it because we still don't know. It's kind of like the estate planning side too, right? Like,
right.
That is supposed to get cut in half. Well, if you were worth 10, you're under 12 million right now, there's really nothing to think about doing. You're not going to probably move things out of your estate just because. But if you're 50 million, you might say like, well, hey, we have way more than we ever need. Let's use past the 12.92 exemption per person and lock in the higher amount. But in this one, it's kind of hard. It's just something to be aware of. And like, as we get more familiar with it, or like we hear the changes are coming, maybe we do take some action. But at this point, it's just know that this could come. And maybe we want to use a little bit more of what's available today, if that's an option for you.
Yep. Yeah. That's a perfect comparison as far as the state tax stuff too.
Yeah.
It's like, yep, this is currently what it is. This is what we'll generally plan for. But I mean, as we both know, whenever it comes to anything with financial planning, you got to hold on to that plan pretty loosely because things are going to change.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. This has been awesome. Anything else that you think that we need to add and chat about on the ISOs? I feel like this was a really good deep dive into people actually understanding, one, just the complexity, two, that AMT exists, three, that ISOs, there isn't tax necessarily on that spread like there is with NSOs. I think we also talked about, the exercising and why a lot of times it can make sense to exercise early due to AMT and not much of the bargain element. But anything else you could think of?
No, I guess the only thing that I would include, not to scare people even more, is that AMT is, so this is a federal thing, but there are a few states that have AMT as well. So that's just to keep in mind, and California is one of them. So California, Colorado, I think Iowa, right? So there's just also kind of just keep in mind, be aware from that perspective too, because I've seen it get caught in the California calculation too.
Okay, cool. Well, Mike, thank you for the time. I appreciate you coming on and sharing all of the info that you did. Let everybody know the best place to follow you. Obviously, we both have talked about your YouTube channel. So for everybody, Equity Compensation, if you don't necessarily want to hire an advisor and you really want to learn, that's a really great resource.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, obviously Java Wealth, the YouTube channel is under the firm name. So it's just at Java Wealth. JavaWealth.com is my website. And then also, I guess from I know there's some advisors that listen to this too, that I also do this beautiful financial plan thing. And so, and with that, I'm starting to roll out some more equity comp type stuff where you can plug in all that stuff and says, this is what your bargain element is. This is what your AMT, your AMT capital gains and stuff like that. I won't actually calculate AMT. You need to have tax planning software to like really do that. Or actually even better, tax pros that can really do this stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the main stuff.
Okay, perfect. Well, Mikey, thanks again for the time, and everybody, thank you for listening. Please rate, subscribe, and we'll see you back next week.